Well, hello, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for our 2023 Community Health Education Series. My name is Ivania Covington with Baptist Health. Now, September is Mental Health Awareness Month, so tonight we're going to be discussing coping with grief. So we have two very special guest speakers tonight who I will be introducing in just a moment. But first, I would like to review tonight's agenda. So we, of course, as always, will review our housekeeping items. We will have the presentation followed by the Q&A. And finally, we will end with some brief closing announcements. Now, as far as the housekeeping items, we only have three, which is we will be recording tonight's session. So that will be made available to all of the registrants. Secondly, we always track our attendance. So if there are any groups who have gathered to view with us, we ask that you just enter the number of attendees in the chat so that we can indicate that for our records. And we thank you so much for joining us. Thirdly, we will be monitoring the chat during the presentation. So as the speakers are presenting, please feel free to write down your questions, type your questions in the chat, and they will be addressed during the Q&A segment. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for the evening. Mr. Marcus Brown, he is the lead chaplain for Baptist South, and Mr. David Morrell, he is the lead chaplain in palliative medicine for Baptist Health. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. So you can begin when you're ready. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So Mr. Brown, you can go ahead and start sharing yours. And you can get started when you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Zenobia. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here tonight. I want to echo the words that she gave. If you really have any thoughts or questions during this time, please, write them down, write them in the chat so we can address them. We're going to talk about just grief as a whole, just 100 feet view of grief. And I like the phrase that we started off with, which is grief is not a curse word. Sometimes grief carries such bad connotations and bad feelings when you think of the word grief. And oftentimes it's, just associated with just one part of life. We take a look at this picture we put up. One of the chaplains gave this to me as a picture when we talk about grief. And it's just someone sitting there feeling empty, feeling like there's a hole, like there's something missing inside of them. It's just something to ponder on and just look at when you think about grief, when you think about what you're going through or what you're feeling. And this title of this is Melancholy, but this is I think an accurate depiction of what it sometimes feels like when we have grief or go through things. First slide. Grief by definition. Of course, grief is an experience of coping with loss. Most of us think of grief as happening in a painful period following the death of a loved one. But grief can accompany any event that disrupts or challenges our sense of normalcy or ourselves. This includes the loss of connections that define us. You can have grief that's associated with where you are in life. It doesn't always have to be the loss of life. Grief can come with work stress. Grief can come with broken relationships, different things like that. I think about even myself, to be transparent. I see my parents and my parents are getting older, but I have anticipatory grief about seeing my parents now and getting older. They're not the parents, when we were younger and vibrant, and they're getting older. So I have grief that one day I might not have my parents. And so that's grief that I carry, that I identify with, just being transparent. Now there are stages or phases of grief. These things are important because I know that sometimes people hear those stages and they think, okay, I can get from 1 to 5. I can get from this stage to that stage. And we've learned, Chaplain David and I have learned in our training that, grief doesn't have a 1 and then it just get to a 5 and then it's done. That's not how grief goes. These are phases and phrases that associate ourselves with grief. You have like shock and numbness. When you first go through something, there's that feeling of that shock that almost shakes you to your core. And then the searching and yearning. And that's trying to find answers of why. People ask, well, how? Well, why did this happen? And these are all normal things that happen when you have grief. Disorientation, where you can't even understand, where sometimes you might get in the car, you don't even know how you got to work, or you got to a destination because you're kind of disoriented. You get there by routine. And then there's reorganization. And usually when I talk to people about grief, reorganization is something that you hope for, but it does not have a time limit. You know, you can't look for reorganization to happen in, you know, a couple of days, or even sometimes months, or even sometimes years. But reorganization is when you can cope with and go about your everyday life, not necessarily forgetting about what happened, but just moreover being able to walk through and remember. And so these stages are not stages that represent, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to be there and I'm going to be fine. And you can see that in this chart here. You know, this chart, one chaplain told me, if you want to write what grief looks like, you take a white piece of paper and you take a marker and you just start to scribble. And that's what grief looks like. It's just all over the place. It's different for different people. And if you notice here, you have things that come around the year mark. There's triggers and there's things that happen that can make you go to these stages and almost start over. And that is normal. That's not abnormal. You might think you're in reorganization and you've kind of quote unquote gotten over it, but then a smell, a song, something might trigger and you go back into the shock and numbness. These are normal stages when you think about grief, because grief is not something that you can put in a bottle or put down and say it's going to be 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so I like to show this slide here to show how it does not look normal. It doesn't look the same for each person. It goes from different places, and it goes from high intensity to low intensity. Just because someone is quiet doesn't mean they're grieving less than someone that is demonstrative. It doesn't go like that with grief. You might find someone who is very introverted and they handle grief differently than someone that is extroverted. So I always like to give people the freedom to understand that, you know, these are not, there's nothing wrong with having grief. It's just when you deal with grief, it's something that touches us all, but a lot of times people don't have what we call safe places to express that, as we'll go over further in this presentation.
So I want to continue and build on what Marcus is saying there, that that graph kind of showed you that grief is all over the place. And so how do you even know when grief has been resolved? You know, the effects, and what are the effects of unresolved grief, and how does it hinder and get in the way of the progression in the aspects of life? And so, you know, maybe the long time relationships have changed or even cut off, drastic change in belief systems and empathy to others. Maybe you've experienced some personal loss where you can kind of relate to that. You realize something that I feel like I realized when I experienced a loss of my mother. You know, that I understood to myself. I just had the thought that, you know, it's time to believe what I say I believe, you know, and am I going to do that? You know, and especially if you're out ministering to someone who has experienced some loss, whether it's a death or some other significant loss that's affecting their belief system, then it's probably affecting their faith. So, you know, does suddenly that void get filled with an addiction to other things, you know, to cope with the pain of the loss and the grief? You know, it's highly affected. The grieving process is highly affected and influenced by how a person views death. And when that gets shaken, either on the approach to the death or after the death, then there's some things to consider while they're feeling the shock and the numbness, the sadness, the anger, the guilt, anxiety, or fear. One of the things that distinguishes grief from, say, depression is that they're also able to find moments of relief, peace, or happiness. So, and maybe in the context that you're working in, and sometimes the context that Marcus and I work in, that has to do with faith and belief. So, on the next slide, I think you're advancing me there, sir. So, you know, I think the idea here is the idea of living with grief, because it's such a process, and because it's not stages so much as it is tasks, and you move in and around and through some of those tasks, some of them, and some of those stages. Maybe you might never go through anger, you know, or maybe you do. So everyone is different with that. And so then to be able to come alongside someone and ask important questions, what is important to you right now? You know, how can I best help you at this time? What can I do for you? What are you hoping for? Perhaps you're thinking in faith, and so you're lining that up with something along the lines of in the Christian faith, Christian tradition. You know, there's a particular person who um, is lamenting or talking about his depression, all the things that are going wrong with his body, and he remembers them well. But this he calls to mind, and therefore he has hope. And so the question then might be, what are you hoping for? What do you bring back to your mind that gives you some hope? What's important to you right now? You know, we acknowledge that the way we see it is not necessarily the way the person we're working with sees it, right? And so somebody once said that what we do as chaplains and what you can do as ministers, or whatever your role might be in dealing with someone with grief, is to realize that, one, you know, we're there to listen, to get, to understand, as opposed to necessarily fix. Doesn't mean we don't have resources, but we might be able to help them and resource them, but we don't have to try to fix them, because we don't know what they're thinking or what they're experiencing other than what they tell us. So listening, someone once said, listening is so close to love that for the average person, it's barely distinguishable. So if you'd like to give some love, listen. You might build a relationship that brings a sense of satisfaction and gratitude, and a heightened sense of spirituality, or an affirmation of their belief, their faith, perhaps the presence of God, presence of a higher power, some connection with the family and the community. So how you relate to this person is in the moment is going to be really important. The next slide kind of continues on with characteristics. You know, what are we looking for? And how are we going to identify who's suffering with grief, especially now when we're talking about the difference between, say grief and depression, you know, or a complicated grief, or something that some depression that might be clinical and require some medication, right? Something that's outside of our scope to do. So how do we understand and see that the isolation that the person is experiencing? And isolation, of course, you know, is loneliness and isolation isn't determined by whether there's people present or not. Sometimes it is, and sometimes that's a physical representation that you're isolated, but sometimes even with what seems like support around, a person still is feeling isolated, or still experiencing some loneliness. Maybe they're having a hard time doing normal everyday tasks, you know, and so finding out about that, you know, in your box of questions, you know, how are you doing on a daily basis? Are you able to do the things that you need to do or want to do each day? You know, are you sensing some strong emotion and intense anger about the grief? You know, as the person, you know, are they, when you do ask questions, are there a sign of being easily angered about the grief. Maybe they have low energy and they're prolonged, that's for a prolonged amount of time, for weeks, as opposed to just coming and going. The natural fatigue that we experience when we're grieving a loss, either a death or some other important loss in our lives. So there might be physical expressions, there might be emotional expressions, there might be social expressions, there might be spiritual expressions. Any of those things. So we mentioned some of the physical ones with weakness, fatigue, feelings of heaviness, maybe feelings of being underwater and not able to come up for air. There might be another type of feeling. If they have chronic illness, it can even exacerbate their condition. And there's a connection between what, and this is, in religious traditions say this as well, that the mind and the body affect one another. And so going through the grief can have these physical expressions, and it can weaken an immune system and be difficult for those who are already ill and experiencing chronic illness or chronic pain. Emotional expressions, feelings of sadness and yearning, feelings of worry, anxiety, frustration, guilt. Social expressions. We talked about the isolation. We talked about the spiritual expressions, the reason for the loss, trying to figure out, why did this happen? Why is God doing this to me? Why did God take them? Why did God take that? Those kind of spiritual expressions. And just, what does this all mean? What happens after death? Maybe I've had some beliefs and now I'm wondering, about that. So the next slide kind of gives us some ideas about disenfranchisement. So what is that? Exactly what is disenfranchised grief? Well, it's basically when you're told that your experience or your reasoning or your expression of your grief is deemed unworthy of affirmation or sympathy or support. It's not openly acknowledged. We want to hide that a little bit. Maybe the reasoning for the grief or for the death. Maybe there's, we don't want to show that. So to grieve would be to admit something we didn't really want to admit. We want to not openly validate and observe it. That's what disenfranchisement might be. Or maybe that's influenced by the cultural rules, within a larger culture. Maybe it's within a particular church and the culture within that church, or maybe it's within a family. The family rules say, no, we don't do this. We're not going to acknowledge that. So that's what disenfranchised grief would be. So the relationship's not recognized, the loss isn't acknowledged, the griever is excluded and from the community, or from just being able to have some comfort and relief that their pain is real. Grieving method of the individual is not socially acceptable. We kind of touched on that. And then there's stigma around the circumstances of the death. So maybe the stigma is about alcoholism. Maybe the stigma is about a particular disease that's been deemed socially unacceptable. Maybe it's about suicide, things like that can disenfranchise and really devalue the person who's grieving, as well as the person who maybe died or who's grieving the loss, and devaluing that that's an important loss. And so I think those are some things to consider. And one thing I would suggest is important for me as a chaplain, or me as a minister, that might be important to you and whatever your role is to be able to do a self-check of, when am I doing that? When am I not giving value and worth to this person and to the loss that they've experienced? Or when am I doing that within me? If I have experienced a loss myself, am I disenfranchising myself more or less by refusing due to some of these reasons we've been talking about, not acknowledging the loss for myself, or the importance of it, or the stigma that associates with it. So I think it's really important. This is a poem, and I want to talk just a minute about the poem here, not talk about it, but let's just read it and then ask ourselves some questions about that. And that is, on Earth, just a teaspoon of neutron star would weigh 6 billion tons. 6 billion tons equals the collective weight of every animal on Earth, including the insects, times 3. 6 billion tons sounds impossible until I consider how it is to swallow grief. Just a teaspoon, and one might as well have consumed a neutron star. How dense it is, how it carries inside it the memory of collapse. How difficult it is to move them. How impossible to believe that anything could lift that weight. There are many reasons to treat each other with great tenderness. One is the sheer miracle that we are here together on a planet surrounded by dying stars. One is that we cannot see what anyone else has swallowed. Rosemary Watola Tromer. So as you look at that, I'll let you just look at that a minute. And as you do, ask yourself, what motivates you to treat others with great tenderness? How can you allow others to see for themselves what they have swallowed and express it? Suffering is in the experience of the sufferer. Yet we can have empathy. We can feel and give compassion. In other words, the sheer miracle that we are here together.
And as we just thinking about what David said, I remember when we say disenfranchised, I like how he explained that sometimes the griever can feel excluded. And I think that that's something big to look at when you think about grief. I remember seeing having a family that one sibling lost another sibling, and over time they felt like they were excluded because they were just focused on the grief that the parents had and they forgot about the child. And so it's just something to think about whenever we think about grief. Sometimes we don't know what we're doing as ourselves. And I like how David said, sometimes we have to look at ourselves and ask ourselves those questions. And that brings us to relationship-based care as the foundation for caring for yourself. I think acknowledging caregiver grief, we acknowledge and address our grief. Not only are we helping to integrate losses into our private and our team worlds, but we also allow these worlds to be enriched by transforming the pain of grief into a conscious living of a fuller life. How to help caregivers grieve. I think when you care for someone and you have to worry about grief, I think one of the biggest things is to acknowledge the right to grieve. I think sometimes we can shut down people's grief, because it may not look or make us uncomfortable or make someone else uncomfortable. I remember talking to someone that recently had a loss, and she said, I couldn't stop just crying in the grocery store while she shopped for food. And as I told her, I said, well, they'll get over it. Just cry. It's okay to cry. It's okay to grieve. To make meaning of a situation, to make someone feel like they're listened to. Telling stories, that's something that's built with caregivers. As you tell stories about the person or the thing that was lost, talking to somebody. David will go later into rituals and what that might look like. but telling stories and making meaning and just acknowledging the right that it is okay to grieve. It's okay to feel bad. It's okay to have these stages and phases that we mentioned. They're okay. And some of the healthier practical ways to cope with someone when they have grief is what I like to call grief dumping. It seems like such a harsh word, but grief dumping has to do with being able to say how you feel in a safe place without judgment. And what I mean by that, remember I heard something at a conference. It said that someone that gets grief off of their chest often feels better than the person that heard the grief. And sometimes we have to be able to find places where we can get things off of our chest, someone to talk to, someone to just confide in. As we say here, that's not going to fix it, but allow what we like to call a safe place. I think creating safe places is something that in my practice, in our practice, is what me and David do, is something that we really, really care about doing, is creating a safe place for people where they can say how they feel, and then that just be it. I don't try to fix it. I don't try to take it away, because I can't take away pain. I can't take away grief. But one thing I can do is I can hear and I can listen. I think that's why it's so important when he mentioned about listening being close to love. When you listen to someone and they just feel heard, it's like their demeanor changes. They have a sudden boost of energy, and they can go on a different time. They can talk. They can kind of get to that reorganization. But a lot of times they can't get there because most people, or some people, find it, beneficial to hold it in, and they hold it in because of maybe the disenfranchisement or the stigmas. But getting out how you feel, I think, is a huge step in going forward with grief. And meaning creative ideas about the loss. I tell people, well, one lady told me, she said, well, I have a voicemail from my husband, and my friend told me I should erase it. And I asked her, well, why? Who is it hurting that the voicemail is there and that you want to listen to it? That's okay. And that was creative for her. And so every year she listens to the voicemail, and she created that as something for her to help her reorganize into her life. When triggers and different holidays come, she listened to the voicemail. So I thought that was really practical about what might happen to us when we're dealing with grief.
So speaking of dealing with grief, title here is Spirituality and Curing Rituals. And I think this is some important things that can be done. And there's just a few ideas that go here. I think if you're in a faith community, a church setting, or not, there are rituals that we already use that we might not have ever really thought of that way, in terms of the way we do our remembrance services or our funerals. Those are rituals, but there's some other things that a person can do that might be helpful. And one of those is journaling and letters. And so when you journal about something, it's actually a time-honored tradition, because before all of this, back in the ancient times, and even not so ancient, in the last few hundred years, there was oral traditions. People told their story. A lot of times in the churches we talk about witnessing, and sometimes that has an evangelical idea to it, and sometimes it has the idea of telling your story, about what's happened. Well, journaling and letters can also be that form, because when you tell your story, you're able to accomplish several things. You're able to express your feelings. you're able to make some meaning. And that's really a big part of it, is telling your story, writing your story, uh, can help tell, can help you make some meaning, and can help a person who is grieving arrive at a place where they can actually um, be okay with it. Sometimes you know how you do with a story, you tell it maybe just a little different each time. We do that with our thinking too, and our imagination, when we're just thinking through our story, and we do it over and over, and then we begin to remember the details a little bit different. So journaling can be kind of like that. You can, like I said, allow for expression of feelings, for the preservation of memories. You can, write letters that include stories of the deceased, talking about the person who was important to you, writing the letter, writing the memories down, helps you sense that influence that the person has on you, or that perhaps the loss, whatever, if it's not a person, there's some other loss. It can help you kind of work through those things. Sharing letters from the past or present can be helpful to the people who are grieving. It lets others see what one person found to be special about the deceased loved one. Letters can be helpful for children who may not have their own memories of the person who died. And they can learn about their loved one from the memories and stories of others. They can do that from your story, from our story. There's some self-care strategies, and incorporate ritual, reflection, and meditation into moments. You can spend time with those who mean the most. Sometimes gathering with people that are important to you just helps you. And it's not that they have to do anything for you, but the fact that you're with them brings about some support, some thoughts, and the ability to express their grief and themselves. Caring for your body, making time for fun, spending time in nature. I think one of a common scripture that we think of is loving your neighbor as yourself, and the most forgotten part of that can sometimes be the part about loving yourself. And so it's okay to do that, to love yourself, to do that in a healthy way. I'm talking about in ways that are healthy for you, that show the value and worth that, for instance, that God says you are, or that we can say to other people, look, you're good and valuable. But you can say that to yourself as well, and love yourself in that kind of healthy way. Another self-care strategy that I like to think about is, before we quite do this reflection, but something that might lead you into that is, there's what's known as the Beatitudes, and it's one of the teachings there says, it says that you are blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, Full, you find yourself cared for. So even as you're caring for a grieving person, you can find yourself cared for, and it can be a form of self-care. Because you've been full of care for someone else. And so I would encourage you to consider that. These are some questions for reflection, so we're going to give you just a minute to read those and reflect for yourself. Compassionate care of the dying and bereaved requires the ability to give of oneself without being destroyed in the process. How do you do that? Someone once said, well, I grew up as a musician, and they would say practice makes perfect. I'm not so sure about that, because it kind of depends on how you practice it. But someone else said, practice makes possible. So how will you do that? How will you practice compassionate care in this case, of the dying and bereaved, that requires the ability to give of yourself without being destroyed in the process.
And I think that brings to, as we get ready to conclude our talking portion, and would love to hear from you all as questions. And I think going to where David was talking about, I think one of the things that I learned most in being a chaplain for the past 9 years is the importance of taking care of yourself. We call it self-care, and finding things that matter to you. And I think sometimes you hear the phrases burn the candles on both ends, and just burning yourself out. I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is to take care of yourself, because the truth is you can't take care of someone someone else without taking care of yourself. And I think it's very important to make sure that you do find things that you like to do, not someone saying, well, this is what you need to do to take care of yourself. I remember one lady told me she was a strong introvert and she was really going through something, and her friends bought her a trip on a cruise, and she told them that she's not going anywhere near that because they tried to create some self-care for her when her self-care was going into nature, going to take photography and things like that. She didn't want to be in a large crowd. So I think it's always important to find what it works for you. When you find what works for you, I think self-care can take on its own shape. It can take on its own, it's like an own organism. So we wanted y'all to hear these slides and talk about grief in these ways. We really hope it was extremely helpful. In the chat and then in the slides, you can see we put these things, and these slides can be given, if I'm not mistaken, and they have a lot of support groups that are in locally, statewide, and even the country, but in the region. But these areas, these slides can be given to you if you know of anyone, or if you need for yourself anything about grief, or anyone that needs help with that. Zenovia is also going to put my number as a working relationship. If anyone here needs to talk further about things or talk about grief, maybe even talk one-on-one, please feel free 100% to call me, reach out to me, email me. We want to create, and hopefully this is useful for you in some way, and we can go further in just talking and listening to each other. So as you get these slides, please reach out to these things if you need. Thank you all so much for your time.
Hey, Marcus.
Thank you. And David's going to share something before
sorry.
we close.
I just wanted to say some of those resources we're talking about, Northwest Florida and Pensacola, but those same things are available. If you go back a little bit, I forget the first ones. There you go. There's the Jacksonville ones. Yeah. All right. I just wanted to point out that there are Jacksonville resources for these groups, Northeast Florida resources. So just wanted to mention that. Thanks. Sorry, Marcus.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Always, if I miss something, please help me. You know how we work, brother. So again, thank you all so much. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll turn it back over to Zenovia and await any concerns or thoughts that you all might have.
Well, thank you so much, Marcus and David. As you all have seen, this is what Baptist has to offer to our community. And so we just so appreciate you two being here tonight just to talk about this much needed topic to be discussed in our community, because there are people who do not understand the processes and really don't know how to grieve in a healthy way, or even know really what grief really is. And so this was so helpful, and I will definitely be sharing these resources in our follow-up email tomorrow. And so if you wanted to go ahead on and stop sharing your screen, Marcus, I'll go ahead on and get this Q&A started. So we had a few questions that I wanted to share. And as I am sharing the questions that I have, again, as has been said, please put your questions in the chat. And if you would like to speak on the microphone, just use that raise hand icon at the bottom of your screen, and that will indicate to me that you would like to unmute yourself, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask your question. So, first question, and this is for either of you. What do you do if someone is dealing with complicated grief? Whoever wants to take that one.
Well, I think the first thing that I would do is the thing that David mentioned when he said listening is close to love. I think when someone's a complicated grief, they're in a place where sometimes they feel they don't want to be closed in or bogged down. And I think the one thing is checking on them in a way, like when he asked those questions, hey, what do you need right now? You would be surprised how much it matters to people when you have what we call routine checks. If someone has a loss and you just say, hey, I'm thinking about you, and that's it. Hey, you need anything? That's it. Over time, they see that you are a safe place because you're not trying to change their grief or uncomplicate it, but you allow them to be in what we call, like we said, a safe place. And so one thing I would do is offer routine checks that are very, very short. Short statements of, hey, how you doing? Just thinking about you. Simple as that. That would be my first thing. David might have something as well.
Well, I think if we're talking about complicated grief, we're talking about something that's extended, and it's not just your everyday ordinary grief. And not to minimize anyone's grief, but when it's complicated, there are multiple factors involved in the grief and in the grief process. And I would recommend doing what Marcus said for perhaps your part, depending on your training and education levels, and use your empathy, use your listening, but also be prepared to know when it's gone beyond your scope.
Good point. Very good point.
And resource them out to grief counselors.
Mhm.
Even as a chaplain, that's something that sometimes I need to do. Is there are people who are trained specifically in more complicated grief, and that person might need more help than I can give. And so I just encourage you to know your boundaries, and then be the support, be the person, ask the questions, like Marcus saying, how are you doing? How can I help? But also be willing to resource it.
Thank you so much for that, because that was actually, we had a meeting with our local pastors, and that was actually something that many of them have brought up, is that a lot of the parishioners come to them for counseling and things like that, and they have recognized within themselves that some of the issues that their parishioners need help with, it is beyond their scope. And so this is the reason why we are having this type of session, because we want to be able to truly be a service, to the people that we serve, and understanding your scope and those limits is very, very extremely important to really, truly getting to the root of issues that, we may not have the capacity to really deal with. So that is a great point. Okay, second question. What do you do when you don't know what to say?
David, I'll let you start this one.
When you don't know what to say, don't say it.
Oh, you can coin that one. When you don't know
Yeah.
what to say, don't say
Sorry,
it.
I think one, relieve yourself of the obligation to have to say something.
Mhm.
In many of the faith traditions, we talk about an ever-present God, whatever name maybe you're using for God, but we talk about God who's ever present. And sometimes just being there and sitting in their darkness, sitting in their pain, is all that person needs in that moment. And that's going to be way more helpful than trying to make something up or trying to reach for something that maybe is a good thing to say, but it's not the good thing to say.
Mhm.
in
All
that
the
moment.
time, yeah.
So Marcus, I don't know, maybe you want to add.
No,
Yeah,
it's just
yeah.
that brings me to a video that we show a lot of times with chaplaincy, the difference between empathy and sympathy. You know, knowing that sympathy is just like, hey, you're down there in that hole, but empathy is just going down and sitting down in the hole, not saying anything.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's the no words or sometimes the best thing. I've had visits, which David, I know he can attest to, where I've been with a family member for hours, hadn't said one word, and they thank you like you've done something. But sometimes it's just being right there, not saying anything, let them cry. As my instructor told me, he said, sometimes I don't bring in tissue because if I have tissue, I'm telling them to stop. You know, maybe I'm telling them to stop
Mhm.
crying. But
Very
what if I just
good.
put the tissue in the drawer and just let them cry and just sit there with them? And I think that's a both impactful question, because I think that we hear that question so much, you know, what do I do? And I think David
Mhm.
said it best, you know, when you don't know what to say, don't say it.
Mm. You don't have to always have you don't always have to have an answer or the answer.
100%.
Very, very good. Okay, and the third question is, can you recommend some practices that are helpful, especially in approaching a person's faith practices?
That's David's specialty, so I know he got that.
I think you need to unmute yourself. Okay, there we go.
So I think there are some practices, and some of them you're going to have to tailor to person. Well, all of them you need to tailor to the person. But if you're working within a specific group, if you're a deacon at a church and you're working with people that are in your faith group and your faith community, you know, there are things that uh, that involve things like meditation. And when I say meditation, I mean it in the very best of senses. You know, I know that word can scare sometimes, you know, especially if we're growing up in a faith tradition. They're like, meditate, not, you know, um, that's a little scary, you know, because it sounds like something I don't do. I pray. But there's you know, there's also the idea of meditating on the word. And so I would suggest practices such as that, um, that are short phrases that will bring a person's thoughts when they drift away or the fear sets in. They have a thought that brings them back. For instance, from my faith tradition, and it may be in other faith traditions as well, the idea of be still and know that I am God. Okay, you offer that phrase to somebody, and then you tell them, okay, now each time you say that, pause and be still. When you find yourself stirring or drifting, say it again. This time, leave a word off. Be still and know that I am.
Mm.
I won't go through the whole thing, but other meditation practices, breathing exercises. Breathing is well known in many of the faith traditions. The idea of breath as spirit or breath of God. So how does that happen in our body? And we know both spiritually and faith-based and scientifically that the use of breath can bring calmness and relaxation and awareness, you know, an awareness within your faith tradition, an awareness that's good for that person. So that's a particular practice that I think of. And so again, practice makes possible, you know. So
Very
I don't know,
good.
Marcus, do you have some ideas?
I like those. I like those. I think that's a way to good, especially if they're of a different faith. I always has someone told me to educate myself before I assume. And as long as somebody's different from me, one thing I've learned about in chaplaincy is that people are different from me, but that doesn't mean that it behooves me not to understand them. and find a common ground that they can, hey,
Mhm.
if they do this, this is what matters to you. And so I remember David using the words, I don't know if he remembers, is when we say, well, what's meaning for you? What makes meaning for you? And I think that's a huge question for someone, whether if they are your faith or if they're not, what makes meaning for them, and not assuming. Because I know assuming can get, it has gotten me into trouble. So I've learned to not do it as much.
There are some other resources that we can send you. There's a grace acrostic that's really helpful for grief and for resilience.
Mhm.
There is if you happen to be in the Christian tradition, there is a thing called the Grief Toolbox, and that's online. So we can send you that, as well as another list of resources that will help you have something close by that's helpful to the person who's different from you.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm gonna open it up to our audience now. We don't have any questions in the chat, but I did want to allow about 10 seconds to acknowledge anyone who would like to. Oh, okay, we have Miss Charlene Lawton. She's raised her hand. So if you would like to, let me just allow you to unmute your mic. Let's see here. If you can go ahead on and unmute your mic, you can ask your question when you're ready. I think you're still muted.
There you go.
There you go.
Oh,
Okay.
wait, you went back to mute. There
All
you
right.
go. Now you're good.
I just wanted to say that this was extremely helpful. We practice ministry of presence in some cases when you're saying, when you don't know what to say or what to do, and we wait for them to be able to speak or to express themselves in some kind of way. So there was information that you provided this evening that was most helpful. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate that.
Is there anyone else? Marcus, David, again, this was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and the resources that you'll be sharing with me so that I can share with our audience. I always provide you with takeaway information that will be emailed tomorrow. I have placed a link with our survey for tonight's session in the chat. Please, we ask that you participate in that survey. Again, this is the reason why we have Marcus, chaplains Marcus and David here tonight, is because this is what our audience has requested of us, to have a session on grief. And so please participate in that session. In addition, we would like for you to pre-register for our final session. We've reached the end, almost the end of our health education webinar series for 2023. And next month, we will be discussing cancer awareness and prevention. And so we know that October is recognized as Breast Cancer Awareness Month, but not only will we be covering breast cancer, but we will be covering or discussing colon cancer, lung cancer, and prostate cancer. So Ms. Carolyn Austin, who is a care coordinator at our Baptist MD Anderson Cancer Center, will be here to present on next month. So without further ado, don't want to belabor any more time. We would like to thank you so much for joining tonight's session. We hope to see you again next month, and that ends tonight's session. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Good night.